this week we must start with Formula One. Now, it's for the first time this season, I think, we got through a whole race weekend, and I was thoroughly entertained throughout, I would say. And that's despite the fact that Max Verstappen got pole and won the race. Spoiler alert. I don't want to say it's the British bias in me, because I am one of the least patriotic people you could ever meet. But Silverstone is a banger of a racetrack. It really suits modern Formula One. It's one of those tracks that just kind of suits it. It's wide enough, the DRS is good but not terribly overpowered. It just always puts on a good show, and I don't think that's just my British bias. I think many drivers on the grid have also said that it's one of the best tracks on the calendar.
Absolutely.
And I think it was helped this year by a little bit of British competitiveness, and not necessarily from the people we expected. What did you think of the weekend as a whole?
Yeah, it was a nice, refreshing change. It's okay. Obviously, Verstappen still, P1, but it was really cool to see McLaren up there. You got to see some of the excitement of Williams and Albon and Sargent. Obviously they didn't finish how they were practicing, but still, I mean, they were able to consistently put some good laps together, and it was just, it was like the race to see who's the best British British team, in front of the home crowd. So, but no, I love, I like Lando. It's hard not to like Lando, and Albon, obviously he's like the underdog you always want to root for, and with the not technically, but presumably the worst team, obviously, in Williams, but I think Haas is giving them a run for their money right now.
And AlphaTauri, yeah. I would say Williams, given the fact that they have jumped up in the Constructors' Championship after that race, they're now seventh, equal with Haas. There's an argument to be made. I think Alfa Romeo are just kind of unlucky at the moment, but AlphaTauri are definitely the worst, and Haas are going through a bit of a difficult period after scoring points earlier in the season. But no, Williams have made good gains. I think the highlight for me of this weekend, before we go into it in more detail, is that the team, the grid does seem to be getting closer to one another. The gap that Red Bull have at the top keeps on shrinking, and that's only a good thing, and you would expect it, considering we've been through the cost gap thing many times. We don't really need to repeat it, but at some point they're going to start falling behind on development, you would think, because of the lack of wind tunnel they're going to have later in the year. And so that gap between them and the next group of cars is coming down. But also you've got teams like Williams and McLaren, who started the year really bad, are suddenly really making gains as well. So it is closing up at both ends, it feels like. Right. So that for me is the most exciting part of the whole weekend.
And it wasn't just like, we know Lando's a good driver. Obviously he can, battle with the big boys, quote unquote. But Piastri was up there too. I mean, we'll get to the final results later, but it must have been that chrome. Maybe that's the new thing. You've got to put, instead of the exposed carbon, you got to put chrome on the car. That's what's going to give you the extra the speed, right?
It's uncanny, how it's come about this time. But I think we need to move on to McLaren immediately, because they were undoubtedly the stars of the weekend. We saw a bit of a resurgence. So obviously Austria saw the debut of the upgraded car for Lando only. Or partial upgrades. They keep saying that there are more upgrades coming in, I believe, Hungary, Belgium, and a little bit later on. But the first entourage of upgrades have arrived on that McLaren in Austria, and Lando performed well. He finished fourth. And we were all like, that makes sense. It's a track that McLaren have gone well at the past. It's a track that Lando's done well at. We got his first podium back in 2020 there. So that was somewhat unsurprising, even though it was like, oh, good, McLaren are back, but that's somewhat unsurprising. Silverstone, however, is a track that that hasn't really suited McLaren in a long, long time. So I wasn't necessarily expecting them to be up there. And then we also had the fact that Oscar now had the upgraded car, save for there was still a difference between them. Norris had a new front wing and a new nose cone. and Piastri had an older one, but had the majority of the new upgrades. And then we get to qualifying, and yes, Verstappen got pole, but for a very brief moment before Verstappen came through to complete his final lap, it looked like Lando Norris was going to be on pole position. And for the first of 2 times during the weekend, Silverstone erupted. The crowd, I've never heard a motorsport crowd as loud as they were for Lando when he got provisional pole at the end of Q3 and during the race that we'll get onto in a moment. It's unbelievable how incredible the crowd was.
This is Into the Apex Motorsport Podcast Network.